Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into something incredibly important today: the strict, legally binding frameworks designed to stop and address sexual harassment and misconduct in Pennsylvania schools. Whether you're an educator, a school admin, or just someone in the community who cares about kids, understanding these rules is literally step one in protecting students. We're going to break down exactly what the law says, how it's enforced, and what happens when the system fails. Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 5 key areas: the ethical foundation, prohibited sexual misconduct, inappropriate communications, professional discipline, and institutional liability. Let's start with Section 1, the ethical foundation, establishing the baseline. The professional ethics guidelines mandate establishing and maintaining an environment that promotes the emotional, intellectual, physical, and sexual safety of all students. So what does this actually mean for teachers on the ground? It means educators have a primary, ethical obligation to ensure the absolute sexual safety and well-being of everyone in their care. This isn't just some optional best practice. It is the fundamental ethical mandate of the teaching profession in Pennsylvania. And this comparison really highlights the stark contrast we're dealing with. On one hand, there's a clear expectation for appropriate boundaries, right? Educators absolutely must interact with students in appropriate, transparent settings. But on the flip side, we have strict prohibitions. The code dictates that there are 0 circumstances, literally none, allowing for romantic or sexual relationships with students. Actually, even entering into an adult relationship with a former student brings heavy ramifications if that relationship started while the student was still in school. The line is firmly drawn. Moving right along to Section 2, prohibited sexual misconduct, the letter of the law. Now, the agency behind enforcing all this is the Professional Standards and Practices Commission, or the PSPC. They enforce Chapter 235 of the Pennsylvania Code. The PSPC strictly mandates that educators shall not sexually harass students or colleagues, nor engage in any form of sexual misconduct. They are essentially the guardians of the profession's integrity. But it goes even further than just the educator's code of conduct. Under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, these specific behaviors actually cross the line into illegal education discrimination. We're talking about situations like a teacher requesting sexual favors in exchange for grades, repeatedly making sexual comments to a student, or even a scenario where classmates subject peers to sexually offensive images or gestures, and the school just stands by and does nothing. Discrimination based on sex is strictly and entirely barred in Pennsylvania public schools. Which brings us to Section 3. Inappropriate communications defined. The Pennsylvania Code leaves absolutely 0 ambiguity when it comes to an educator's digital and verbal interactions. It strictly forbids communications involving sexually explicit messages or images, soliciting romantic relationships or sexual contact, commenting on a student's physical or sexual attractiveness, or sharing jokes or stories of a sexualized nature. And it honestly doesn't matter if it's a text message, something on social media, or a conversation in person. Plus, the PSBC specifically looks at whether these communications were out in the open or concealed. If an educator is trying to hide their chats with a student, that is a massive red flag. All right, let's look at Section 4, professional discipline and consequences. Under the Educator Discipline Act, sexual misconduct is a primary ground for severe professional discipline. 2 of the most serious outcomes you'll see are revocation, which is the forced termination of a teaching certificate or employment eligibility, and surrender, which is termination by consent. And if an educator is actually convicted of certain sex offenses, the PSPC is legally required to immediately suspend or revoke their credentials. I really want to emphasize the permanence here, because it's a huge deal. The Act permanently bars from reinstatement any educator who the PSPC finds guilty of sexual abuse or exploitation. Let me say that again, permanently barred. There is no second chance here. If an educator's certificate was surrendered or revoked for these reasons, they are forever banned from getting their teaching credentials reinstated in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we are not just talking in theory here. The 2025 PSPC annual report highlights real public adjudications where educators faced swift and permanent discipline for crossing these exact lines. We see Michael C. Potterson facing revocation for inappropriate conversations with a minor student, John Hole surrendering credentials for sexually abusing numerous juvenile males, and Kevin S. Schiegel receiving an immediate suspension for possession of child pornography. The system is actively identifying, investigating, and removing individuals who threaten student safety. Finally, Section 5, institutional liability and reporting. Enter the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, or the PHRC. They are the ones who enforce the state's key anti-discrimination law. So, while the PSPC focuses on disciplining the individual teacher, the PHRC zooms out to evaluate the school's actions as a whole. They look closely at how schools handle claims of severe bullying, sexual harassment, and discrimination. This right here is the vital legal standard you absolutely must remember for school districts' responsibility. It's about a school's liability if they knew or should have known of severe or pervasive and regular harassment of students, but failed to take actions reasonably calculated to end the mistreatment. Ignorance is simply not an excuse. If a school turns a blind eye and allows a hostile environment to persist, they can and will be held responsible under the law. So to enforce all these protections, there is a very clear mechanism for accountability. First, school administrators have a mandatory duty to file reports of allegations with the PA Department of Education within 15 days. Second, victims and their families can hold schools accountable by submitting an education intake questionnaire to the PHRC. You generally have 180 days to file that from when the discrimination occurred. Then, step 3, you participate in the PHRC investigation and fact-finding process. If they find probable cause, they can literally direct schools to undertake corrective actions to fix the situation. We've covered a ton of ground today, from those unwavering ethical baselines right through to permanent legal consequences and institutional liabilities. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought for today's explainer. Knowing the strict legal and ethical boundaries, the enforcement mechanisms, and the immense stakes involved, what steps will you take today to help uphold the sexual safety of all students in your educational community? Because true safety doesn't just happen by accident, right? It's maintained by informed, vigilant communities. Thanks so much for joining me today.